World Schools Debate Championships 2023 now. So, welcome to the grand final. I hope you guys are all as excited as we are. Joining me on the panel today, my name is Serena, by the way, will be Alan, Ananya, Andy, Catherine, Jenna, and Yiju. Now, in proposition, we have EEC Red, and in opposition, we have USA Red. Congratulations to both teams for making it this far. What I'd like to do now is just invite the teams to introduce themselves, give their speaking orders, and if they'd like to do so, to reveal their preferred pronouns. So starting with proposition EEC Red, would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
Speaking first is Kaylee, and I use she, her pronouns, also be doing reply.
Speaking second is Sarah, I also use she, her pronouns.
Speaking third is Elena, she, her pronouns.
Brilliant, thank you guys. And opposition, USA Red.
Hi, I'm Ollie. I will be speaking first. You can do the reply.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'll be giving the second.
Yeah, I'm Chelsea, I'll be giving the third.
Brilliant, thank you guys. Okay, I'm gonna try to use a timing app. So, the teams let me know if they can hear the following, and I will have it up at the top. Yeah, it'll be just fine. Okay, cool. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to invite the first speaker of the proposition to open the debate. This House regrets the narrative that democracy is the only legitimate form of governance.
Real quickly, just a general note, you have to get pretty close to the mic for it to work.
It's quite.
You should be loud on PLIs too.
Here? Okay.
We find it regrettable that states that do not conform to the idealization of the West must suffer in perpetuity for their own sovereignty, that individuals are stripped of their right to autonomy, identity, and self-determination, and that is why we propose today's motion. I'm going to do two things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to provide some couple pieces of setup and then two constructive arguments. Firstly, on why we get worse scrutiny in terms of decision-making and accountability of power under opposition side of the House, and then secondly, why we're better able to access self-determination and choice. Firstly, on setup, I want to clarify what the counterfactual looks like in this debate. I think that the most likely counterfactual is that multiple forms of government are seen as legitimate, including democratic ones and non-democratic ones. Why is this likely? Firstly, historically, there were multiple forms of governments that were propagated due to cultural reasons. From Asian emperors, for example, who justified their rule through Confucianist philosophy, to regions in the past, such as Roman emperors. That means that there's likely incentives to justify their own forms of governance and their own power over their people. Secondly, and notably, people are unlikely to simply accept corruption and abuses of power. So I think that opposition must also consider a variety of cases, such as technocracies that perhaps do have certain incentives to improve output legitimacy, for example. Lastly, this is also a retrospective debate. Therefore, both teams must analyze previous ways in which democracies were used, in which this narrative was actually used and propagated to actually win this debate. On to the first constructive. Why is it that scrutiny in terms of decision-making and accountability of power diminishes far more under this narrative? I first want to characterize how and when this narrative is actually used in status quo. First, this narrative was created through a variety of philosophers and great thinkers and has been strengthened as the most dominant narrative ever since the Cold War, for example, where the West has supported democracy as the root cause of the fight in that war and has propagated several narratives such as McCarthyism and the Red Scare and multiple ways of that Red Scare to ensure that this narrative remains dominant. Today, this narrative is continually dominant in Western societies, which leads to a variety of harms that we'll be analyzing later in the speech. Currently, and ever since the late 1900s, we think that this is the most dominant narrative that is propagated in the status quo, that has pushed politicians to lead into divisive rhetoric and further polarization. Why has this narrative decreased accountability? We think that this has caused several Western interventions, several ways in which sovereignty has been violated through multiple reasons. Firstly, after the post-Cold War, it has been used and indoctrinated into Western states. It looks like narratives within educational systems or narratives in the media, such as the Red Scare and McCarthyism, in which people were literally subjugated and pressed for their beliefs if they differed from actually supporting democracies, for example. And this is crucial because politicians are indoctrinated by these types of narratives as well. They're indoctrinated by their fathers who tell them that communists are evil. That has caused genuine concern for people to invade certain regions purely out of quote-unquote concern for their sovereignty. This looks like invasions into Vietnam or the Middle East in the vast majority of instances, which this was only just solely justified because of democracy. But secondly, this narrative is also perpetuated by societal norms and media norms. And notably, this is a cyclical and reinforcing effect. This is especially important in the context in which this narrative is used, which is most likely democracies. The narrative means that politicians are forced to garner support domestically and improve their political will of their domestic constituents that actually entirely believe in that narrative. And what that suggests is that they must act on that type of support, even if they themselves did not believe that democracy was the only legitimate form of rule. It entails further intervention because of that type of social norm in which people are coerced to get power because of that type of social norm. Thirdly, even if this is not the only factor in which interventions are used within the status quo, we think that it is a major reason as to why interventions exist in the very first place. It is a tipping point at which interventions actually occur. Perhaps it's true that there are other reasons, such as economic self-interest, that have caused these types of wars. But more often than not, we think it is also passes that type of tipping point to be ideological, because states cannot justify losing their own American soldiers, for example, if it costs millions of lives to do so. What they ought to do is strengthen that by using fear-mongering through this type of strategy, for example, to explain why communists are inherently evil. We think that this is a powerful narrative and powerful rhetoric that pushes people to believe that this is not necessarily an economic battle, but rather one that is ideological inherently.
You know what?
No, thank you. This ideological indoctrination passes that threshold. It means that it is particularly effective in instances where people who perhaps don't care, or in Western states that are already economically stable, for example, that already have jobs available to the vast majority of their citizens. The implication is that there is a massive amount of international abuse of Western powers under the opposition side of the House. It means that millions of lives are lost, states lose their sovereignty and the right to their sovereignty, and we think that was abhorrent in this debate. Before moving on to the second contention, I'll be happy to take the floor.
So, countries like the United States probably value democracy under both sides of the House. The difference is that they're unable to do things like impede on the democracy of others under our side of the House. How do you engage with that?
No, our argument is that they use this narrative to impede on the sovereignty of other nations due to the three reasons I just gave. Secondly, why does this increase scrutiny on policymaking? And this is the second part of this first constructive. This deals specifically with the internal policymaking within states in general, rather than international policymaking. Firstly, we think the over-sensationalization and the glorification of democracy entails that people believe that their policies are inherently superior, that because people voted on them and that there was general support for those policies, that they were infallible, and that other policies caused by communist states are inherently not as great. In the counterfactual, additionally, it is unclear why one narrative is stronger than the other, and therefore there's likely to be more scrutiny in terms of policy making, insofar as there's a variety of different norms that are considered. We think that, secondly, attacks of being anti-democratic as well are used in the status quo. So it looks like politicians during debates saying other policies are anti-democratic, rather than actually engaging in reasons for why they might be bad. That looks like AOC and other anti-establishment politicians not being able to necessarily express their points of view solely on the basis that they are perceived as anti-democratic and are immediately dismissed because of that reason. Rather, under our side of the House, we would have far more internal accountability over those policies when there's a deeper level of scrutiny far beyond just being stated as undemocratic. On the second contention, why is there more a right to self-determination and choice that is fulfilled under our side of the House? Notably, this has both principal and practical implications. I first want to prove why it is true that other forms of governance that are non-democratic can be good. Firstly, you can maximize efficiency during policy making. Things like the filibuster or political gridlock within democracies mean that it is oftentimes incredibly slow when passing certain policies. This is incredibly harmful for developing states or during times of recession where quick policy making is necessary to actually act on certain things that require that quick policy making. Secondly, though, non-democratic institutions must also justify their non-democratic power through effective output, i.e. making people's lives tangibly better, technocrats using this in Singapore to improve housing, education, and economic outputs, for example. We think that this means that there are other forms of governments that are equally as important and equally as legitimate, and we think that people ought to have a right to choose that type of governance that they can rule over their own lives. That is why we propose.
I thank the speaker for that excellent speech. The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 17 seconds. We now look to the first speaker of the opposition for open office.
Can everyone hear me okay? So fine? Alright. After the first speech that we get from side government, I'm left really confused as to what a proposition world actually looks like. What governments truly emerge when competing forms of thought exist and are allowed to proliferate? Why does violence go away in a world where competing governments exist and proliferate in that nature? None of that was ever really answered on their side. So I want to start this speech with one quick note on framing, which is to say that no government in today's world or ever is a perfect democracy. We think that this narrative exists as something that is largely aspirational and materializes in governments that sometimes in some form truly strive to be representative. This includes things like democratic republics and parliaments. So we don't have to defend these governments as perfect, but rather that their aims are basically good. So we think our world looks like one in which democracy is broadly valued and governments take active steps towards it. Note that this is a much clearer picture than we ever get from side proposition. Starting with their counterfactual then, it is probably true that proposition gets competing thoughts on what governments are good. That also means that you probably get the emergence of less democratic states because people and governments themselves don't have the same incentives to strive towards these things. Their first argument looks at scrutiny of these regimes, and they argue accountability first here. I think this is a weird argument to make because violations of sovereignty are largely not due to democratic principles or because the ideals of democracy exist. Our invasion of Iraq, for example, was not for democracy, but for lucrative pursuits of oil and resources. They needed to explain why those economic incentives wouldn't create the exact same actions on their side of the house. Then they talk about communism a bit. I think that communism is not inherently anti-democratic, but rather a Western desire for hegemony that created that narrative, and that was not due to strong democratic values. So it is also probably true that the same anti-communist narratives would have been proliferated by Western actors in their world. I'm sorry, proposition, but regretting democracy is not the same as regretting interventionism. Then they say that domestic checkbacks probably exist, right? Or that they're bad. But the US left Vietnam because our domestic population thought that this was a bad thing. So it's good to have democracies because it means that we can actually take action against intervention when it happens. That's the benefit that we get on our side. It's worse to have authoritarian regimes intervene because there's no way to stop them. Then they talk about glorification. And I just don't think that democracies are likely to operate in this way. I think that democracy encourages checkbacks, criticism, and scrutiny of the policy that your government is creating at the point at which you are actively encouraged to vote for or against it. Glorifying is certainly more of a threat in autocratic regimes where constant propaganda campaigns stop people from dissenting. Then they talk about efficiency. We think that compromise is possible in democratic regimes, that politicians want this because it makes them look better, it makes them more likely to win election cycles. We do think we get things done. Just look at democracy's responses to the COVID-19 crisis. This is going to clash with the self-determination point that they try to make. It was largely confusing to me, but I'm going to introduce our first substantive to really address that. And this is a principal justification for democracy. Well, I want to characterize that people are born with inherent autonomy. That is to say, our bodies and our identities are the most fundamental form of property. But that being said, we don't have control over everything that happens to us. Particularly, we don't consent to being born into this state, having our rights and freedoms governed by some overarching body. We think it becomes a legitimate autonomous choice to stay in society at the point at which governments adequately balance protection of our most fundamental rights with inherent freedoms. That is the point, whereas if given a choice, I would choose to be a part of the state regardless. 3 reasons why that principal claim justifies democracy and only democracy. Firstly, because democratic states are the only ones that account for these inherent freedoms in the first place. These are the only governments that think that constituents should be able to exercise things like free speech, religion, and expression. Notably, not valuing those freedoms contradicts democratic thought in policymaking because you cannot represent a body of people that do not even get to make choices as to how they represent themselves. That's why we get access to more of these inherent freedoms that we think all people principally deserve. Secondly, though, democratic states provide recourse when government fails to adequately uphold people's interests, right? So balancing rights and freedoms is really, really difficult, and the state is going to inevitably sometimes fail. But more than that, just because I did not consent to being born into the state, I should have some say in the decisions that it makes about my life. This means that I must be able to do things like vote people out. I must be able to amend legal systems and appeal court decisions, exercise ultimately some form of ownership over my government. Otherwise, I am denied ownership over my person as well. That is a fundamental right that necessitates democracy. Thirdly and finally, though, we think that all people are equally autonomous. This is really, really important. I do not have more of a claim or less of a claim to autonomy than anyone else in society. What does this mean? This means that democracies aim for people to have equal vote in government, equal say in what happens to them. That's the only form of government that is going to account for the equality and autonomy that we all possess. Before I move into our second substantive argument, share your point.
If you ask a homeless man, would you rather have fulfilled the principle of democracy or have food on the table, what would they say?
I am so confused as to why these are mutually exclusive. I think that democracies can probably do both much better than authoritarian regimes or any other form of government. I'll mechanize that for you in our second substantive, which is about increasing the standard of living. Why are democratic adjacent governments always more likely to practically guarantee a better quality of life than anything else? The first reason for this is accountability, and this has already been thoroughly discussed, but democratic governments cannot massively oppress people and run the economy into the ground to the same degree that other more unchecked forms of governments do, because there are easy check-back mechanisms. We think this happens through things like elections. So for example, we voted out Trump in 2020 because we largely rejected his form of government. The UK rejected Liz Truss when she steered the country into what people found to be the wrong direction. Secondly, though, there's a devolution of powers in democratic states to some extent, because democracies, contrary to other forms of government, think that one person or body having all power is a bad thing, right? Unilateral, bilateral, even trilateral decision-making reduces the extent to which people have an equal say. So you're more likely to see things like a split between executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Secondly, though, on progress. Politicians must improve life for their constituents and not just stagnate in order to win elections. So in a lot of authoritarian regimes, you can kind of just keep the status quo perpetuated forever. But in democracies, we think there is a constant cycle of improvement at the point at which politicians always need to have a claim that leads them to win election cycles. Thirdly, though, on equality, we think that the common people have a voice in government that they fundamentally don't without democracy. So they can form coalitions and come together for common goals. It's ultimately harder to suppress minority groups. Fourthly, we think this prevents conflict and increases peace, especially within the state. At the point at which people have a civil mechanism to deal with discontent, you're less likely to get violent revolution. This is just because violent revolution is probably much harder to do than voting, so I'm more likely to try voting first. I want to do a bit of weighing here as well, right? Civil and political rights, to address that point of information, are a prerequisite to economic rights, because you cannot protect economic rights if the government has total power to take them away at any point in time. Economies and authoritarian regimes get more concentration of wealth at the top because there is no way to take it away from a fundamentally self-interested government. So the only way for me to not just access but protect my economic rights, the things that guarantee that I can enjoy an adequate standard of living, is through civil liberties, is through making sure that I can check back on the governmental abuses of power that we think are inevitable at the moment that you give the government power without giving the people a say in who's in charge of them. At the end of the day, this debate is very, very simple. Democracy is the only legitimate form of government because it is the only government that protects people adequately. We're very, very proud to oppose.
I think the speaker up by speech. The speaker's break for 7 minutes and 58 seconds. We now let the second speaker of the proposition to sign the substance.
Panel, democracy in and of itself is not something that is valuable in the same way that free speech and other rights opposition talks about in and of itself is not valuable. We only value these things because individuals themselves choose to say that this either I value free speech more or I value other rights more. So I think what opposition had to prove in this debate is why the context they talk about, so free speech, etc., are necessarily something that is actually the most important and the most valuable rights for people in the first place, whereas we tell you on proposition, these cases will change, people's preferences will change, we can best accommodate those changes, and on that basis we are so glad to propose. I'm going to talk about a couple things in the speech, but I'm mainly just going to do refutation first, and then some more explicit rebuilding. But under refutation, before I get into the substantive claims, I want to firstly deal and explain what exactly is a counterfactual. So opposition tells you that it's more likely that individuals will strive for democracy and strive for the best version and outcomes in democracy. And to some extent we agree with this, but I think it is important to clarify what exactly, what democracy, meaning that is the only legitimate form of governance, actually is. We think it looks like, for example, it is often taught in schools. It is often indoctrinated in media and your surrounding environments where taught that democracy is something that is the most valuable. But I think what is also equally important to note is that saying democracy is the only legitimate form of governance also implies an inherent demonization of the other types of governance systems that could potentially exist in the world, because that is the reason for why democracy is the most legitimate. It suggests that the other systems are comparatively much worse and much poorer off in some instances. So what is the implication of this? We think that in a counterfactual, without this narrative, you would likely have competing different types of governance that emerge. And given that it's unclear as to why one particular type of governance will be more stronger than the others, and you have all these types of competing narratives, we think then what people make their decision on is not this idea of being indoctrinated into buying into democracy, but rather it is based on more so objectivity, where you can still look around and look at different nations and point at instances of democracy, of authoritarian nations, of socialist nations, and point out objective facts as to which one you think is necessarily better than the other. So this is why we think decision-making capabilities are our choice, and by extension things like self-determination are increased. So I just wanted to make that very clear what the counterfactual was. But now let's get into what the actual substantive is. So the first part of their case is basically this principle. And they firstly tell you that we ought to value democracy because that's the point at which you can have rights like freedom of religion, freedom of expression, etc. But two responses here. Firstly, we do not think that this is true, that this is something only democracies can actually achieve. Because if you look at examples of other forms of governance in the status quo, right? So for example, if you look at Singapore, other nations, their technocracies, or other forms of governments, you can still have religious practices, you can still express religion, and you can still express your identities, and governments can still take input and take feedback, even if it doesn't manifest in the way of voting. And this is the second problem, which is they do not necessarily explain why democracy is exclusive, i.e. why can citizens not contribute towards the state in other ways? Why does it have to be uniquely voting? We do not think that is something that was actually proven insofar as many non-democratic nations in the status quo in certain countries do take an input from citizens. We do think that this is something that's viable and something that is plausible. But finally, I think this is the most important thing, because the ought principle kind of assumes that things like freedom of speech are the most valuable thing, or like things like freedom of religion are the most valuable thing. But we don't really get an explanation for why this is true, because we think, and Keely kind of clarified this in a PY, which is that for each person and for different regions and different contexts, we think people are likely to value different things. Not at this moment, I'll take you before I get into rebuilding. Given that people value different things, whether it's because of context, some people might value more redistribution of wealth compared to free speech. Other people might value things like better policy more than free speech. And maybe some people do value free speech most. But we say regardless of what types of things people value most, I said after a refutation, regardless of what types of things people value most, because it is true that inherently on an individual and collective level, people value different things, we allow for the maximization of that choice insofar as people are no longer indoctrinated into believing that one certain type of policy or governance is necessarily the best, so they're more inclined to actually utilize choice and push for what they think, and what types of policy and what types of governance they think are best suited for them. So we think that is why we actually win on the principle clash, and why we're able to maximize choice and get the things that people actually need. But the next part of this claim, actually, so before I get into the practical, I will take the POI.
So given that there's a multiplicity of different views in every state and different people value different policies to different extents, why isn't it that democracy is able to balance those preferences to a better capacity than authoritarianism or counterfactual?
But we think it does depend on context specific, right? So if you look at places like Singapore, we do think that they relatively have good governance. Sure, there are individuals who will not disagree, but no type of governance is necessarily perfect. Because even on their side, when you look at case studies of democracies, where perhaps it is true people have more input, or even if you take them at their best, the point is you still don't get perfect representation of what each and every person wants, right? We only really value democracy because we think the majority of people value it. But if the majority of people in a region do not want democracy, they would rather have something like socialism, they would rather have something like a technocracy, we say that is a more valuable and more justified opinion. But the crucial difference is that is an opinion that you cannot actually access to its truest form in opposition's world, where the vast majority of people are taught growing up that democracy is something that ought to be valued the most. So I think that is why self-determination is something that matters and is exclusively accessed on our side of the house. But finally, let's go a bit on the practical about this idea of why you can have like better quality of life. We just do not think this is true for several reasons. We think firstly, even in our worst case scenario, which is authoritarian nations, there still often are incentives to have things like appeasing citizens and having things like economic growth. Because for example, China derives its legitimacy from economic growth. You can only have stable governance if your citizens are actually appeased. If every single person in your country is starving, even if you are a dictatorship, they will likely revolt. We think governments and leaders do not want this, which is why they have incentives to push for good growth and push for good quality of life. And then talk about things like devolution, but like I think this largely already falls, and like I'll explain a bit more in our own practical why we think that other forms of governance can be valid and can be good. So, what exactly does Kaylee tell you? She firstly tells you about accountability on democracy. And I think what's important to evaluate is that there are different contexts in which this applies. Because in some instances, democracies like the West enter into conflict because they are scared of things like communism, because they value things like democracy. But it is also equally true that in other contexts, sometimes nations enter into conflict not because of democracy, but they use the guise of democracy to justify their interventions. So the problem here is that the response that we get from opposition says, well, no, Western nations will do it either way for economic reasons. It firstly does not deal with the first context Kaylee tells you about, as to why like sometimes it is just true that these nations go into conflict because they value democracy and because they're afraid of other forms of governance. But secondly, even if it was true that like they would still want to do this for economic reasons, we think the glorification of democracy is something that significantly propels their ability to actually do so, because insofar as like people no longer glorify democracy, there's likely greater scrutiny, greater discourse on an international stage actually criticizing, for example, the US's intervention in Iraq and other failed types of interventions. So we think that is something we're uniquely able to access on our side. Greater scrutiny in the instances and greater judgment and deterrence of these types of actions in the future. We think those are the contexts opposition never sufficiently dealt with. But finally, I think Kaylee did a bit of work to explain, and I did a bit of work to explain, as to why economic success can be achieved. And I think what's important to realize is like, this isn't this House regrets motion, right? So the reason as to why many of the democracies often potentially point to throughout this round are strong is because at the point of turning towards imperialization to some other form of governance, a lot of strong states chose to enter into democracy. But we think that on our side, if the narrative had been different, perhaps it would have been true that it would have chosen another form of governance. And if, for example, if the US was a technocracy, it could have been equally strong, if not stronger. And there's no reason to suggest as to why a democracy is necessarily always better economically or for its citizens. So, but we think the principle ought to be weighed more heavily, because in order to access choice and to have that representation, being able to accommodate what people want is a prerequisite. This is the round-winning principle, so if I could propose.
I think to speak for that speech, the speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 15 seconds. We now look to the second speaker of the opposition to further obstacles.
DPM says freedom of speech and other democratic rights are not valuable in and of themselves. They say, they're only valuable because we as humans said they were valuable. But panel, is that not an instance of me exercising my own autonomy? That is, I, along with billions of other people, have as individuals chosen to want these rights. They say people value different things. But how can you ever know on your side what they actually value without things like free speech, without things like voting? Insofar as they do not prove why human autonomy was unable to decide what should be valuable and what shouldn't be valuable, they lose this debate. A couple of things I'm going to do here. Number one, just some quibbles on framing. Secondly, refuting proposition material before finally extending what Ollie gave you in first and introducing our third new substantive argument. Firstly, though, on some proposition refutation, I think the first thing that is problematic with their case is that it's highly unclear after 16 minutes why communism was mutually exclusive in the first place with democracies. This is a large, material of their case in the first place, right? A lot of this actually predicates on the fact that communism is a mutually exclusive form of government, but I don't think this is really clear in the first place. I think other narratives in American history, such as the idea of the American dream, the idea of being able to pull yourself up from the bootstraps, played into things like the Red Scare. I think this was largely symmetric on their side of the house. They tell you that fear-mongering is used in democratic countries to justify this. Again, we told you that other narratives existed in America that were compelling and therefore used to fear-monger. But secondly, we told you that these democratic instances were completely symmetric. The difference, though, was that a broad narrative of democracy meant two things. Number one, the US was probably more likely to respect other countries' sovereignty, other countries' rights internationally. Number two, that democratic allies on a global level can check back and call out problematic democracies in a way that was compelling due to the existence of that narrative in the first place. DPM then comes up here and says a couple of other things, but the primary problem I have with this is that a lot of their argumentation just justifies why other governments can, in some idealistic instances, be good, but that was no reason why they were legitimate inherently. The first thing they tell you is that, sometimes autocracies can have maximum efficiency because the authoritarian leader just needs to self-justify their legitimacy to the population. Couple of responses here. Number one, they can also just equally likely violently suppress or control information or oppress the rights of individuals. It was unclear why one was more likely than the other. Secondly, I think this is more likely because power tends to corrupt. That is to say, the types of people who become authoritarians are probably the ones who are already wealthy, probably the ones who are already of a majoritarian ethnicity, probably the ones who came from a long line of political lineage, so on and so forth. They were unlikely to be benevolent. But even if you don't buy that, it was the option to do this that existed in places like authoritarian states that fundamentally made it illegitimate. Finally, narrative fear-mongering is probably far easier, far more likely, and much more effective in non-democracies. That is to say, state-induced propaganda in places like Russia that systematically brainwashes individuals and disconnects them from the world writ large. They say that people value different things. They say, look to Singapore, where the majority of people value autocracies, or look to other places where the majority of people might value the technocracy and not necessarily something like voting rights. We told you the answer was really simple. Number one, consent can never be retrospective, and number two, consent can never be presumed. That is to say, if you don't have that democratic election, if you don't give these individuals a right to vote, you cannot assume they have given the consent to do so just because the majority of them might like it, just because the majority of them are already living well off in an economic state. Secondly, it could never be retrospective. You were never consenting to being born in that state in the first place. Therefore, the government could not just impose whatever it was, its nature, onto your autonomy and claim that you must like it because you're economically well off. Final thing they tell you is that democracies enter conflicts because they're scared of other government. We told you that it was for ulterior reasons, that there were plenty of alternate economic and political reasons, such as literal wars going on in Vietnam around the world during the Cold War, such as literal wars happening in the Middle East that drove the US to do this. However, here's how you should evaluate this clash in the case that you think it's a wash / both sides have been true. This should generally prove that there's been a historical correlation between non-democracies and things like violent conflict, things like economic destitution, so on and so forth, which should only solidify our argument that these governments tend to be illegitimate. Okay, second thing then that I'm going to answer is the fact that this is used as a justification to attack other countries and implement democracy. Firstly, as Ollie already told you, our invasion of Iraq was not for democracy, but it was for lucrative pursuits of oil and resources. We stayed in there for another 20 years in places like Afghanistan because of our lucrative incentives for oil in the first place. Because of our regional incentives against Russia during the Cold War, we wanted to become the unipolar global power, not necessarily the bipolar one. That's why we were competing with them in the first place. Secondly, though, even if this is 100% true from their side, just look to instances of democracies having intervened in the past. I would argue that in a lot of cases, we fought for individuals who were absolutely marginalized, and in a lot of cases, those individuals were far better off. For example, look at the NATO coalition in Srebrenica, Bosnia, where we prevented mass slaughters by the government. Look at the UN in Kosovo, which saved thousands of Albanians in the first place, and even the global impetus amongst democracies to currently help Ukraine and denounce Russia. Final thing I want to note here, though, is that legitimate governments cannot be predicated on instances only. This was a problem with the proposition case. You cannot say, what if an autocratic ruler is a good one? A, that's not a reason why autocracy as a system in and of itself was legitimate. They never engaged us on that principle. But B, we've given structural reasons why power tends to corrupt. They're not likely to stay benevolent, even if they originally were. On this idea of partisan gridlock, then, we have three responses. Number one, compromise is still largely possible, right? Because if nothing gets done under Biden, for example, he gets blamed, so his party loses. So to avoid that, you get like across the aisle compromise, and Republicans and Democrats tend to come to the table to do something like that. Secondly, though, we told you politicians are largely accountable to their constituents because of things like public backlash, because there are election turnovers and they want to get reelected into the future, so on and so forth. That did not exist in autocracies. That did not exist in authoritarian regimes. Thirdly, though, we told you that the base floor of rights, and this is taking them on their absolute highest level, the base floor of economic conditions are likely higher in democracies because there's a robust constitutional system likely, and there are good checking mechanisms with things like judiciaries and legislatures to protect things like your individual autonomy, so on and so forth. A couple of extensions then on what Ollie told you. Number one was the principle. We're really, really ahead here. The word legitimacy in the resolution lended itself to a principle argument quite nicely because something can be good and beneficial but still illegitimate and immoral. We told you firstly, people are born with autonomy and choice, and we should preserve that system. Their side of the house commodified individuals as a means to an end, like puppets attached to strings. Secondly, we told you people didn't consent or choose to be born into those states, so the only legitimate form of governance was granting them the right to choice in the first place. Thirdly, we told you that inherent freedoms protected by the nature of democracy were good. But even in governments with these freedoms, things like equal rights were crucially missing because no individual was born greater than another. Simply, governments pass policies that affect, benefit, or harm me. Governments probably tax me, and I probably follow the laws that my government creates. The consent argument was super, super intuitive. Third substantive then on democratization globally. There were two ways in which this happened. Number one, I think the narrative of democracy is likely to spill over to institutions like the UN, NATO, ASEAN, so on and so forth, and also at global conventions that conglomerate dozens or hundreds of countries over an issue like climate change or human rights. These international institutions give all countries a voice and a vote, allowing them to participate in the democracy that is the global order. That prevents a few superpowers from corrupting and controlling international laws, which implicitly answers all of their US hegemony arguments, unilaterally determining the clauses for treaties, so on and so forth. I think countries have a right to sovereignty / self-determination on issues that necessarily concern them. Historically, the UN was created at the end of World War II, when the new sole global superpower, the US, was establishing itself as a democratic crusader of the world. Had the form of government, had the reigning form of government been a different one, this would have looked very, very different. Just look at the Congress of Vienna, for example, or the division of Africa under those respective wars. I think at that point, there was a necessary democratization of the world that was necessary to protect the individual sovereignty rights of nations in the first place and protect their legitimate grievances in the global order so proud to oppose.
I think the speaker got speech. The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 8 seconds. We now look to the proposition third speaker to further proceed.
Okay, disclaimer, I'm very sick, so if I start dying in the middle of speech. I want to note how normative the mindset a lot of us in this room has. We started off living in a democracy, and we've been taught by the media, by schools, by those around us, that this is the only legitimate form of society to live in. That's why we believe this is the ideal form of society for us to live in. But historically, in the past, when we had systems of monarchies, when we had systems of emperors in the past, we believed that was the only legitimate system because we've been taught that as well. So we say this sort of system and what we believe is legitimate is taught through the narratives of society, is taught through media, taught through schools, taught through what the government teaches us, and taught through the international and what we believe in the dinner conversation and social media. On our side of the house, we say we include a more inclusive sort of narrative, but we say there is no objectively a legitimate or illegitimate force of government. Rather, we say that all sorts of governments are legitimate insofar as people actively opt into it if they believe that this is something that they actually prefer. And given that we prove to you over and over down the bench that there are mechanisms and reasons why people often choose to opt into alternative sorts of government, we say we're winning on that. I'll do two things in my speech. Firstly, on the issue of self-determination, and secondly, on the impacts to people's lives on the practicals. Under the first thing, I want to know what proposition pushes to us under the principle. They say that we often have rights towards certain things like freedom of speech, and those are things that because we were born under the state with our consent. The response to this we gave down the bench that they never actually dealt with the crux of was that these things are not good in and of itself. They are good because we actually want them, because people chose into it and opted into it. But given the fact that we say there are other fair trade-offs to make if you choose to trade off perhaps economic benefits for these sort of freedoms, we say that is legitimate. And self-determination is important because it is a prerequisite to opposition's principle and the main push from them first. Even by second, they never provide free speech and religious freedom is a good in and of itself. Rather, it is only valuable because people believe it is valuable. But if people believe other sorts of things are more valuable, we're better able to extend that agency and autonomy towards them, flipping their principle after. What this means then is that our side are better able to flip that principle to actually provide them with a choice and autonomy to be able to access those sorts of things. Their response to this is only practical, which they say, you are often likely to believe that other sorts of systems are superior, so you're never actually able to properly consent or properly choose or weigh off between which system you prefer more. The response to this is twofold. First, I want to note that there are opt-out mechanisms that allow us to think about what sorts of things are actually available to us in society and which one we prefer better. And this is due to the global trend of globalization. We're more likely to interact with other people through the rise of social media. And even in authoritarian states in China, we increasingly see younger people using VPNs to interact with other sorts of media in society, to be able to see other sorts of access of system that they might prefer more. So we see there's actually an opt-in mechanism of choosing which systems you prefer more. But second of all, if people really dislike the systems they actually lived in, they're actually likely to hold up their own measures against it. People can revolt. People can actively hold up signs and protest like how we see in Hong Kong. And these are things that signal to the international community that they do not want this sort of system. And that's why international aid and change can actually happen on our side of the house. I'll expand more that on the second theme. But the takeaway from the end of this theme is twofold. First, that if opposition metric in this round is on self-determination and choice, we better expand that because we expand the sorts of options available to the most in people. But second of all, that we prove why there are opt-out mechanisms under our side of the house, regardless of their side, that their side is not the only mechanism to be able to access that. Go ahead.
Even if I'm born into a democracy and I've been taught by media, I can still choose to vote in redistributive policies. The comparative is me being able to do nothing about the state I'm born under your side of the house.
There are other alternatives that we talk about. You can protest, and international communities are likely to step in. I'll expand more on that in my second speech. But I also give another reason, which is just that if you really disliked it, people often hold revolts or coups or often things against the government that we've seen historically in the past. So those are extreme measures, but if people really desperately wanted it, like your cases suggest, then we see there are other options they can take. Second thing then on the impacts to people's lives. The first thing I want to deal with is opposition's claim on accountability. They say democracies give you accountability because you can vote out the government that you dislike. I have three observations to make under this. The first point is just that note that even the democracies at the front of the push for saying democracies are the only fair and legitimate choice still have instances of corruption. So even in the US and UK, there are subtle things like corruption, like the revolving door. That means politicians often place weaker regulations on certain industries to get a seat out there after they retire. So these are instances, and note that from birth they can see that there are flaws within these systems anyways, these systems that they value most. And what this proves then is that there's often accountability issues on their side of the house as well. But I want to note that their side actually lacks huge amounts of accountability in the status quo, because people on the front are unable to hold them accountable when they're told in literature, in media, in social media, and by society and the government as a whole, that there are no other better alternatives than democracy, that this is the only legitimate form of system, and there's not much that is better. So there exists corruption in the status quo, even in the most fair of democracies, as they can see from first, except they're not properly able to hold them accountable. Whereas on our side house, we see democracy often do have flaws, and people are more likely to buy into the narrative. Democracies are things that could have issues, and more likely to view these things objectively. We gave this from first, no response down the bench. But second of all, I want to note that democracy are often not that representative. Think about the many lacks of autonomy that minorities often face in these states, but their needs are often severely overlooked. And before they come to say that this is not comparative, note that there are other systems like technocracies in society that do exist, where these experts do have an incentive to make sure that their fields of knowledge are done to the best possible, or at the very least, this claim is basically symmetric, where accountability and basically infringement on autonomy is largely symmetric, and these are mitigations towards their case. But lastly though, on our side of the house, accountability from outside sources still exists, because our narrative and the frame we pushed from first was never that other options are going to be far better, but rather that people are able to choose for the mechanism they want. So people genuinely dislike the authoritarian system they live under and continuously protest the international communities like the US and the same economic incentives that they prove to us that they have incentives to basically invade other countries for, are still likely manifest, and they're likely to go into these countries. The difference on our side is that they do not have the legitimacy to invade any other countries that do not want it, because they no longer have that sort of justification on their side house. Right now, We see on our side the difference is that states who do want this sort of change are able to get it from international actors, but states who do not want that are unable to get it. So we actually increase the amount of accountability and better increase people's agency as a whole. What is the claim we push to you on our side? We explain that Western states often use the narrative of democracy for their own gains. And their response to this was that many of these regions often have alternative incentives to enter into these regions, and this is not the main reason. But I'm unsure why there's a dichotomy there. There could be multiple incentives to why they chose to enter, but what happened was that these states used the justification of democracy to get those economic incentives. We say economic incentives do exist, but they use this justification to basically get around international sanctions and scrutiny and displeasure to the domestic population. So what we do is that we take away that justification and that frame that they hide under and basically deny that they're about right. No, thank you. The narrative on our side is very simple. We see people with globalization have access to basically view the other options, and people are able to opt for the options that they want. What is the weighing metric of why we will value this claim about interacting with other states and denying their sovereignty over their lives, over democracy? Two things. First of all, it's the fact that once you enter another state and it goes poorly, you often end up losing millions and millions of lives. Because often, forcing democracy onto a nation that isn't willing to have a democracy or isn't likely to be able to get a democracy costs millions and millions of lives because you have very corrupt institutions. You often have democratic backsliding a few years down the line. More people are put in prison and there are more government crackdowns. On our side, that largely does not happen because people are free to live in the state that they prefer. But second of all, the weighing here is very simple. If their claims on sovereignty, we say these states do not have a right to infringe on other states' sovereignty due to the fact that you as an other state are infringing your own opinions on another. So the weighing metric here at the end of the day is very simple. First, on practicals, we actually save far more lives on our side because we actually provide people with a system they would like. But on opposition's own metric, which is saying that democracy is based on people's will and democracy is something that's good, we say we give people far more will because people are actually able to choose what sort of system they want, and they're far more likely to be able to access their principle better on our side of the house. On that basis, we're very, very proud to stand on our side.
I beg to speak that the proposition of my speech, the speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 58 seconds. We now look to the third speaker for opposition to further obstacles. Sorry, thanks.
Can everyone hear me? Cool. Down the bench, side opposition was quite confused. How exactly do people choose which regime type they live under? Did the people in Iraq really choose to live under a system of authoritarianism as they claimed? Do they envision a world where every 10 years people take some sort of magical survey to choose which regime type best fits their own needs and desires? That was completely implausible. We had no idea how this narrative that was under their side of the house and wishy-washy was likely to actualize itself. And even if at one point people chose to consent to technocracy or to authoritarianism, their decision was a permanent one where individuals would no longer have the ability to protest, choose democracy, and access all the choices that we said were so critical to their human condition. So on that basis, we're very happy to oppose this motion. In this speech then, I'm going to chat about 3 main areas of clash. Number 1, whether or not people are indoctrinated into liking democracy and whether that even matters to begin with. Secondly, is this narrative true that democracy is innately the most superior or legitimate form of governance? And lastly, whether or not this will be abused to justify things like intervention. Number 1, on indoctrination. Now, the counterfactual underside proposition was very wishy-washy all throughout this round. They say that we're going to leave the regime type undefined. We don't know which system is the best, so people can probably just decide that for themselves. I want to note a few reasons why they could not support this counterfactual. Number 1, proposition needed to engage with the history of why this narrative even exists to begin with. That we've already historically had these discussions as to which regime type is the preferable one. And collectively as societies, we have decided that things like democracy do matter towards us. That all the conversations that we're having right now have historically been had before. We didn't all wake up one day and decide to choose and love democracy, but presumably this was a collection of different historical conversations that already happened and people already chose to buy into this narrative to begin with. Number 2, The same way that they claim individuals can be indoctrinated into liking democracy, they can certainly be indoctrinated into accepting corruption as well under their side of the house. And I would recognize that technocrats all the time already use rhetoric, contrasting their immense knowledge, for instance, against the lay person and how little they know. But notably, I think this actually tells us what the counterfactual is likely to be under their side of the house. That it's not a world in which we, every 10 years, choose which regime type we live under, but instead, we're authoritarians, where people with lots of media control and lots of power in curating our social narratives are able to demand that people accept things like corruption, are able to demand they accept things like authoritarianism. That was likely the most likely counterfactual under their side of the house, where we don't have a belief that democracy matters. Notably, that was exclusive to our side of the house. No thank you. But thirdly, I think this just fundamentally misunderstood the motion. Well, the motion isn't even about indoctrination into this narrative. There are still a plurality of different narratives that presumably exist. Some people are still willing to accept things like technocracy all throughout their lives, and presumably that implies that there is still some choice that currently exists as to which narrative you buy into. This debate is saying that on side opposition, we're very happy and that we're very fortunate that most people do like democracy and that most people have bought into this dominant narrative because we think that it is the one that maximizes things like happiness and choice for individuals all throughout their life. So it wasn't about indoctrination in the very first place. But even if it was the case that we did indoctrinate some people into liking democracy under our side of the house, we're quite willing to accept that for a few reasons. Number one, was democracy is already likely to represent their best interest in 99% of cases. The democracy is the way in which you do things like demand more efficiency in your government if it's not being efficient enough to engage with their best play, maybe, unlike gridlock. But moreover, that's the only way in which you can actually state your preferences. So to a certain extent, we can presume consent, given all the benefits that do accrue to individuals under our side of the house. Given that it's impossible to set up a new regime every 10 years, presumably democracy is the one that represents the best interests of people on net. But number two, even if people are coerced at a certain point into accepting and liking democracy, I would note that democracy opens up far more choices for them later on in life that are equally meaningful towards them. That even though they didn't choose maybe to live under democracy, the fact they do opens up choices about redistributive policies, about economic policies, interest rates, countless other things that individuals might want to demand throughout the course of their lives. And all those choices that they can vote on every 4 years certainly outnumber the choice of regime that they nebulously talked about under their side of a house. Secondly then, whether or not this narrative is true that democracy is the most legitimate form of governance. Our claims here were relatively simple. Number one, that democracy intrinsically preserves autonomy. That's the only way in which you can do things like try to self-defend or advocate for your best interests. But number two, critically, when people do believe in the value of democracy, they're far more likely to engage thoroughly in that democracy. The value of that democracy does increase. You're likely to see decreases in things like voter apathy. They're more likely to do things like try to improve their own democracies and make them function better for themselves. The fact is, democracy is the only system that can flexibly change all throughout time, where you can constantly vote on, for instance, the different electoral processes that exist within that country. Presumably under their side of the house, you lock yourself into an alternative regime where there's far less flexibility to initiate those changes. So notably, the only reason proposition actually named all throughout this round as to why democracy would not be good is was it's less efficient, was there's gridlock within the system. I want to note a few main things. Number one, this was simply not inherent to democracy. In a second, was in fact, we think that efficiency is probably a critical part of democracy at the point in which you need to, for instance, have effective governments to actually actionize all the policies that you're voting on and all the visions that US citizens have. Under our side of the house, when people do really value democracy, they presumably want to improve that democracy to the greatest extent and realize the full value and the full purpose of that democracy. But secondly, I want to note that there are internal mechanisms that make democracies far more efficient than authoritarian regimes. In a second, because you're likely able to do things like protest the inefficiency that does exist within government. They can vote out someone when they're highly ineffective in office, and that is why you can self-correct under a democratic regime, but presumably less so under other ones. I'll take the point.
Throughout history, we went from tribes to monarchies to democracies and back to dictatorships. Clearly, when people want change, you're able to push for it. On your side of the house, you can't actually access that when you demonize other thoughts of
It's a one-sided change. You can't, backslide in authoritarianism and then be like 5 years later, actually I want my democracy back. That is absolutely absurd. I'm not actually sure why people are able to protest and get these flexible regime changers under their side of the house. The last thing note here is that we established why democracy was likely the only justified form of governance. that you simply did not consent to the state to begin with, and this was the only way in which you would be able to exercise your own free choice, for instance, or advocate for your own best interests, and exercise autonomy as a human being underneath the monopoly of the state. We heard absolutely no response as to why democracy was principally required as an extension and as a form of preservation of that human autonomy. The last thing I want to talk about is possible abuses of this narrative, just to engage with their intervention claim, which is really the last standing constructive material they even have in this round. Number one, at best, this argument was entirely a wash. With some interventions do install democratic regimes, but many other ones probably threaten democracy. So for instance, the US launched like a series of coups all around the world to do things like actually take down those democracies, counter democracy, stage their own sorts of regimes that exist within those countries. So presumably, all of those interventions under our side of the house now become far less likely. They become illegitimate, for instance, because you can't justify taking down democracies. So at best, you wash out the types of interventions that do exist. But number two, we said that ulterior motives would still suffice as justification. That in Iraq, for instance, you didn't need to say that you want democracy to exist in that region, but they simply did not want weapons of mass destruction. I'm not sure why these regimes with tons of economic incentives can simply invent other justifications for all of those reasons. So it's on that basis we're very happy to propose.
We go to speak that speech. Speech was 8 minutes and 16 seconds in length. We now look to the opposition reply speaker to close out the bench.
Everyone good to go? Cool. I think that it's a very good thing that we as a society have broadly moved away from our historical roots in monarchies and autocracies. As humans evolved, acquired more knowledge, and innovated better technologies, we adopted democracy as a value. I don't think that this was arbitrary. I don't think that we're all sheep subscribing to some random normative ideology. Rather, I think that decades of sophisticated political thought led us here, and that we make intelligent and autonomous decisions to agree with that thought. Two very simple questions in this speech then. Firstly, what makes democracy inherently valuable? There was a principal claim that we gave you an hour ago that proposition largely skirted around. This argument wasn't just that things like free speech are probably good, but that we have an inherent right to autonomy that any form of government that is not democracy will always violate. The idea here was pretty simple. I do not choose to be born into this state, so I am owed some say in how it governs me. States that aspire to democracy were more likely to grant me this voice, because I can vote, because I can protest, because I can appeal court cases and change government outcomes in some way when I don't like them. That was a fundamental human right that a legitimate government could never infringe upon. They never gave us an alternative form of government that could protect this right. That was a very easy way to immediately oppose. But then they backtrack a little bit, and they say, look, in most governments, you can still protest, so we probably solve for this. Sure, but democracies protect my right to protest without being killed. I think this feeds into our principle quite nicely. So it was not indoctrination to teach children that they deserve to choose how to live their own lives. It was not demonization to think that it is wrong for governments to invalidate these rights. We thought these were generally good ideas that we were happy to support. Second question then, why do governments that implement democracy get better outcomes for people? I'm going to start by looking inside the state here. We gave you a lot of reasons why you tend to get better lives in democracies. We talked about accountability for bad government decisions. We talked about how you get progress rather than stagnation because politicians want to win elections, not just maintain their power. Thirdly, we talked about equality. We said there were more opportunities for minorities to congregate, that they could then protect their economic rights from government infringement. So we may have had an unlikely outlier where some other form of government protected some of these rights, but we thought that democracies were broadly better to live in. They say, look, in the worst case, if you really hate your government that much, you can have violent revolution. But we thought that was a pretty bad worst case, that if bloodshed could be avoided by a ballot box, we were always going to be quite happy to oppose. But now let's look outside the state to interventionism and infringements on other states, which is the only positive material we have left on proposition. Alex and Chelsea both make it quite clear why it was wildly unstrategic for the proposition to claim that violent oppression was the reason why aiming for democracy was uniquely bad. Not only did we tell you that wars waged by democratic countries were surely not waged because they had democracies or liked it so much that they were willing to let constituents die over it, there were other motivations. We went into Iran because of nukes, in Vietnam Vietnam because of security dilemmas. Surely, as Chelsea explains to you quite well, there were other narratives that could be crafted to legitimize violence. None of that was likely to ever be avoided on their side. But at worst, it's at least symmetric on their side, because authoritarian regimes obviously wage war too. They don't seem to be the justification of democracy to do these things. In fact, it was worse when those actors did these things, because their citizens were never able to mobilize to stop those abuses of power. But we also got more sovereignty in another way too. And this is the third piece of material that Alex gives you, where it says that democratic values extended outside of states into the international sphere. So the value of democracy is why we reject things like hegemony, why we give countries a vote in the UN, and we enable them to protect and represent their sovereignty claims. This is an extraneous benefit that we have no proposition response to, far too late in their reply. On every front, it was pretty clear that we deserved democracy, that we were better off when we got democracy, and that no other form of government was ever going to make that untrue. On every front, Team USA is very proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker for that reply speech. The speech was 4 minutes and 3 seconds in length. Last but not least, to close out the debate, I'd like to invite the proposition reply speaker.
Opposition in this debate hinges their case on proving why democracy is good. But this was not sufficient to prove their case. They also needed to prove why it was the only legitimate form of government that exists, why non-democratic states were illegitimate forms of governance. And the issue with their case is that we proved the same benefits of authoritarian nations, that they could be quick in terms of decision-making and providing practical outcomes that were beneficial to their citizens. These were all reasons as to why these forms of governments were legitimate and still unengaged with at the end of this debate. But even if it were true that democracy was good, this does not mean that the narrative itself was desirable. We told you the process in which democracies were established through interventions, for example, sometimes even failed interventions, was never worth the human life and the human cost that exists. We told you in third, this was the way. Imperialism versus the benefits of establishing democracy, and why that type of intervention was incredibly harmful. We said there are instances in which intervention occur with the main objective of spreading democracy. Even if there are examples where perhaps Iraq's intervention was not justified through democracy, there were other instances in which interventions were justified by democracy, and we said those were the instances that achieved our aims. We said, in terms of weighing, the permanent loss of life of millions outweighed the benefits to citizens from democracies because, firstly, the degree to impact and the margin of change that democracies provide to their citizens versus authoritarian nations is very unclear. We provided reasons for why perhaps a quick decision-making process during times of recession or during times where this quick decision-making was necessary provided clear impacts to their citizens. There are perhaps other reasons why democracies are available and good alternatives, but this doesn't necessarily mean that there is a large margin of change. Comparatively, the largest delta is the thousands of lives being lost through interventions, and that was something that we would never give up in this debate. On to the first theme. Is democracy inherently superior to non-democratic forms of governance, and what are the implications of the question? They say yes, democracy is superior. It provides benefits and upholds the preferences of people on the ground. This did not engage with our content, that there were other alternatives that could also access the exact same impacts that they wanted in terms of delivering tangible impacts to citizens on the ground. This was crucial because it meant that this was not the only form of governance that could access the impacts that opposition wanted in this debate, and we could actualize that through centralized power. Technocracies, for example, could utilize this to ensure that they have good policies for their citizens. They also tried to state that authoritarian states are inherently bad and corrupt, but there was no actual mechanization for this argumentation. We told you that authoritarian states that were corrupt were more likely the ones that would not be good democracies on either side, under their side as well, even if they were developed into a democracy upon imperialism. We told you the demonization and indoctrination of authoritarian nations, and that the impacts of intervention were so large that we would not outweigh that. On to the second theme of the principle. They tried to say that we have an inherent right to democracy because of the social contract. But as we noted in third, people do not consent to democracy either. Your vote is 1 in a million, for example, and it's deeply unclear as to how you can consent or change that system meaningfully. Their reputation that people did not choose to live in a certain system applied to their case as well, which they failed to recognize throughout the entirety of opposition bench. We said there was no inherent value to democracy, that democracy was a construct created by Western nations, there was no inherent value to it, and the value that we ascribed was rather through systems that were consented into. That on principle, we ought to be able to opt into certain forms of governance without infringements of our sovereignty, that the same individuals that had a right to make informed decisions, irrespective of indoctrination and irrespective of the practical, that they ought to know what they want and retain that system that they wanted. It was on that basis we were proud to
And then speak for that speech.